Ladies and gentlemen, what a great honor and pleasure it is to be with you, and thank you for those wonderful remarks by both the leading professors of this great university. And for me, it's a joy because Wits is famed around the world, and it's a tremendous honor to be here. It's also, as we've heard, a very auspicious day, because this is the day that world leaders are arriving in Africa, and Africa is leading the world over the next 3 days. And this is extremely important. I am sure this will be an absolutely wonderful summit. I expect Donald Trump will be watching on his television set all of the tremendous successes that are achieved and all that we are able to push forward because Donald Trump is home. So this is all very wonderful and extremely exciting and auspicious. I'm also thrilled that this is sponsored by the African Center for the Study of the United States. I want to know, what have you discovered? Can you explain to me what is going on in my country? It's pretty weird, actually. But we have almost the opposites meeting today. President Trump and Mayor Mamdani. Mamdani, the Sublime, and Trump, the ridiculous, I could say. And we are, of course, very much believing that Mamdani is the true representative of the future of the United States. Donald Trump is the reactionary gasps of an old order. And that is literally what is happening. Maybe I'll share a few thoughts about that along the way. We're here to talk about the shifting global order and Africa's place in the shifting order. And I think we all feel, we know, we are seeing geotectonic shifts of a magnitude and a speed that are astounding right now. So we're all trying to keep our balance a little bit and try to understand what is happening in the world. There are at least 4 basic, deep transformations underway, or you could say disruptions underway in the world system. And the first is, maybe I could even divide it into one more, because I was going to say geopolitical, technological, ecological, and demographic. But let me start with the economic changes, then the geopolitical, then the technological, ecological, and demographic. So I'll count 5 very deep changes that are underway, and they're all occurring simultaneously and in a strongly interacting way. Perhaps the deepest underlying change is economic, and the most profound change in the world economy is that the industrial age had privileged one small corner of the world, the North Atlantic region, basically the United States, Britain, and continental Western Europe, for about 150 years, from around 1800 to 1950. Of course, there's a long story that precedes that, but with the burst of industrialization that came with massive technological advances, especially around the steam engine and the ability through steam power to mobilize massive industrial production, that industrial revolution began in Britain. Britain, therefore, assumed an advantage economically and then militarily that created the worldwide empire of Britain by the end of the 19th century that included about 25% of the world's population. And that industrial revolution spread decade by decade across continental Europe, taking about a century to spread from the home of industrialization in Britain to Russia by the end of the 19th century. And it jumped across the Atlantic to the United States, which underwent industrialization with a lag of roughly 50 years behind Britain. And so by the second part of the 19th century, the United States had become an industrial power after our Civil War, and Germany had become a major industrial power on continental Europe. And it is fair to say that because of the concentration of industrialization in this relatively small corner of the world, this transformed the world economy fundamentally, and it transformed global power fundamentally. Because it was in the 19th century that European imperialism reached its full power, and Asia was substantially imperialized and colonized in the course of the 19th century, and Africa, of course, fell under European imperial control almost completely by the end of the 19th century, and especially in the second half of the 19th century. It took one more, if I could say, innovation to bring about the culmination of full imperial control of Africa at the end of the 19th century, and that was the British invention of the gin and tonic. It was quinine on the colonial veranda, which protected the colonial powers from malaria, that enabled the final sweep of a very ruthless imperialism by the end of the 19th century. And so if we looked at the world in 1900, it was essentially owned and occupied and run by the North Atlantic region, which we call the West, a kind of strange name on a sphere, but anyway, it's the name that stuck. The Western world is basically the North Atlantic world. There's a lot we could discuss. How did that happen? Why did it happen there? It's a fascinating story. I tried to speculate about it in a book called The Ages of Globalization, which I hope some of you might find interesting. I'll just say one snippet of my thought about that, and it is the unique fact that Europe colonized the Americas in the way that it occurred after Columbus's voyage that explains a lot of the rest of history. The reason being that China could easily have been the global power. China could have ruled the oceans because in the 15th century, China dominated the Indian Ocean. China could have circled the Cape of Good Hope. China could have found a sea route to Europe. China could have gone around the Pacific and found the Americas. But in 1434, despite having the largest naval fleet and the leading naval technology in the whole world, China unilaterally abandoned the oceans. And this is one of the hinge moments of world history. There were many reasons for that. One was that the Chinese felt there wasn't anything out there in the world that they didn't already have, so why should they bother? And another part was that to the extent that they faced danger, it was coming from the dryland steppe regions of the north of China, the nomadic invasions, the Mongols and the Manchus who would come, and others from the dryland region. So they thought the oceans aren't our problem, it's the Great Wall of China is our protection rather than the oceans. So in 1434, the Chinese abandoned the oceans just when Henry the Navigator in Portugal was exploring the Atlantic Ocean and developing navigational capacity using a lot of Chinese technology, for example, the compass itself, which had come from China. And it was Vasco da Gama, not a Chinese admiral, who circled the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. But one thing that is interesting and important is that the Europeans were able to colonize the Americas, both north and south, for an absolutely accidental reason, not because of the superiority of power per se, because there were 100 million or so Native Americans when Columbus arrived. The Europeans obviously did not discover the Americas. The Americans knew that they were there. So the Americans had been there for 10,000 years, and the recent estimates push that back to more than 20,000 years from the first migrations across Beringia from Asia to the Americas. So there was a large Native American population. Within 1 century, it had declined by about 95%. That is what opened the continent for Europe and what gave the early capitalism its incredible lift of resources: land, gold, of course, silver, bullion, and a lot of transformation of ideas. Why did the population collapse by 95%? Actually, not mainly because of the plunder and the attacks and the depredation, though that was real. It was because of the pathogens that the Europeans brought, because the New World had been separated from the Old World pathogens for 10,000 years. There wasn't malaria in the New World. There wasn't yellow fever. There wasn't bubonic plague. There wasn't typhus. So when the Europeans came, this was a absolutely unprotected population in the Americas, and it was a mass dying off because of the pathogenic exchange that occurred during the 15th century, during the 16th century. By the way, the die-off was so severe that land that had been cultivated in the Americas reverted to forest to such an extent that carbon was captured from the atmosphere in such a scale that it led to a drop of temperature on the planet and what Europe calls the Little Ice Age at the beginning of the 17th century. So if you've seen pictures in Europe of Bruegel, of people skating on the rivers in today's Netherlands, the ice froze over because there was a little ice age, which actually came from the reversion of farmland to forest in the Americas. To my mind, without going into more detail, this is what gave Europe this extraordinary advantage, because suddenly there were two, quote, empty continents. They weren't quite empty. There would be genocides for 3 more centuries by the Europeans, but the dying off was a pathogenic disaster, and it opened up the Americas for the European colonists, and it changed the global balance of power for many centuries to come. It was the steam engine that added to that, because that made industrialization possible, and industrial power meant military might. It meant the industrialization of armaments. It meant new artillery. It meant the railroad. It meant the telegraph that could reach into the interior of continents. And with a very bloody-minded Europe, a very rapacious and plundering Europe, by the end of the 19th century, the world was essentially in European control, except for the country that you're studying, the United States. So it's just worth saying a word about that. The US spent the 19th century engaged in war. It spent the 20th century engaged in war, and it's spending the 21st century engaged in war. So it's very simple. But in the 19th century, the United States was engaged in war in creating a continental economy. Because remember that the United States was born in its Revolutionary War between 1776 and 1781 as just the eastern seaboard of North America, a very small sliver. But the Americans in the new nation immediately had the idea that all the land of North America would ultimately be theirs, an idea that was famously called manifest destiny in the 1840s. So the mindset was take over all of the land to the west. And that meant many wars, sometimes the good luck of a purchase or two. When Napoleon had his back to the wall and needed to raise cash in 1803, he sold the land rights to what was then called Louisiana, but was a huge land area east of the Mississippi River, to the Americans. Our first president, who was considered a great president, and he had certain greatness, was a pretty ruthless land speculator, by the way. He made his name in the 1760s, I'm speaking of George Washington, invading lands in the Ohio Valley region that the British didn't like, but he was he was a landowner and a land speculator, and so the idea was conquer the lands towards the west. It took the United States basically the 19th century to finish the conquest and the settlement of North America with all of the genocides of the remaining native populations in between. And when we usually date 1890 to the final completion of the North America of the United States, what did the United States do? It said, all right, we got the continent, now the world. So immediately the international imperialism began. And for the United States, this meant catching up because Europe was way ahead in imperialism. So the first thing they did was overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1890s. Very nice kingdom, but easy to overthrow. And then in 1898, on a pretext as shallow as Trump's pretext for his upcoming invasion of Venezuela, they went to war with Spain. Actually, it seems like a boiler blew up on a U.S. vessel in the Cuban harbor, and that was attributed to the Spanish. Almost surely the Spanish did not blow up the ship, but it was a great cause for war, and the U.S. was itching for empire, and so the war of 1898 between the U.S. and Spain meant that the U.S. became the imperial power of the Philippines, which it still occupies, although we don't say it so that way because that would be impolite, and Puerto Rico, which we do occupy, but we call it a territory. It's not a state. It is a colony, and Cuba. Those fell into U.S. hands. Cuba became independent in 1902. I set the stage because this was the world that is now completely changing. The world was a Western-led world, and Western imperialism defined the world up until mid-century of the 20th century. It would have continued a lot longer, but Europe went into a paroxysm of the most brutal civil wars imaginable between 1914 and 1918 and 1939 to 1945. And this destroyed Europe at its own hands, not from outside threats, but from internal civil war. And by the end of the Second World War, Europe was broke. It was indebted to the United States. The United States said, now we are the world's superpower. We'll be an empire, but not exactly the same way as the old empire. We'll exercise our power in different ways. We'll dominate the international institutions. We'll dominate international finance. We'll dominate the international monetary system. We will have military bases all over the world. And if you get out of line where we have a military base, we will overthrow you because you are hosting us and you will be a good host, thank you. And so this was a different kind of empire, but it was a continuation to some extent. But the important point is that in 1950, the more or less the end of European imperialism was at hand, though in Africa it was a drawn-out affair over many decades. But India regained its independence in 1947. China became actually a sovereign country for the first time in decades in 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Indochina gained its independence step by step only after the US fought France's anti-imperial wars into the 1970s. But step by step imperialism was, in its formal sense, was brought to an end. And the reason I'm emphasizing all of this is that it enabled a remaking of the world economy. Because as long as the West controlled the world system, as long as the West colonized Africa, as long as the West colonized Asia, development could not occur. Because colonial powers are not interested in development of their colonies, period. They're interested in exploiting their colonies. They're interested in quiet. They're interested in control. They're not interested in education, in infrastructure, except to the mines, like in this region, or to the plantations, but they're not interested in broad-based development. So in 1950, if you took a snapshot of the world, other than the fact that Europe was in ruins, but that would be rebuilt within a 15 to 20-year period, almost all of the industrialization of the world was in Europe or the United States, or to a small extent, the other offshoots, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the one exception, Japan, which for very interesting historical reasons had become the single country in Asia to industrialize at the end of the 19th century. And that's why Japan became an imperial power invading China from 1894 through 1945. With independence came the ability of development. And this is the main point that I want to stress. So it's a long, basic point to get to the bottom line. From 1950 onward, of course, depending on the specific history of each region, it became possible to have autonomous development in sovereign areas of the world. Before that, under the European system, it was not possible. It was not occurring. But after 1950, it could occur. And step by step, it has occurred. Not everywhere and not evenly and not what we want in Africa, because the main change has been in Asia up until now. However, with a lot of change in Africa, to be sure, just not at the depth and speed and success that could have occurred had geopolitics and history been somewhat different. But what did occur after 1950 was the catching up of Asia. And this is the most dramatic change in the world scene. And it's a change of profound historical significance because it really is a change of centuries scale, not something just before our eyes of 10 years or 20 years. The rise of China is the single most significant economic change on the planet in centuries from the point of view of relative economic power and performance. China has become the lead economy of the world, the largest economy of the world. China is at the forefront of almost every major technology, sometimes with the United States, sometimes ahead of the United States, because the US abandoned its technological efforts on green technologies, for example. So China alone leads the world in electric vehicles today, in photovoltaics, in wind turbines, and so forth. So this is a very profound change, and it's extremely important because it's Africa's future, which I will come to. But the main point of this first of five, and I promise I won't be so long-winded on the others, the first of five changes is we have ended the Western-dominated world. We're at the end of that. The G20 in Africa maybe signifies formally the end of that. We're in a multipolar world economy. And the United States is an important country, but its share of world output is about 14%. Its share of population is 4%, so it's a little more than 3 times the per capita income of the world average, but it doesn't dominate the world. China's share of output is 20% of GDP, measured at purchasing power prices. So the first of these major changes in the world is that for the first time in centuries, we are not in a Western-dominated world. And that's the second point, the geopolitics. Not only has the world economy dramatically evened out, though not fully, but of course, world power has also shifted tremendously in the same direction. The United States cannot bully China. It has tried. It tried as recently as 6 months ago. It put on 100% tariffs against China, expecting China to get down on its knees and beg for mercy to Mr. Trump. And China said, okay, 100%, and we'll raise you 20%. And the United States said, okay, and we'll raise you export bans on microprocessors. And China said, and we will raise you with export bans on rare earth magnets, which I had never heard of before, but then discovered that every major industrial process needs them. And the United States backed down within about 48 hours. And that's the new geopolitical scene. We have several great powers: the United States, Russia, China, India, are 4 nuclear superpowers. They are not at equal level of strength in different dimensions. The United States still has a global reach that is unique because it has military bases in 80 countries around the world, and because the US dollar is used for about 60% of settlements of international transactions. But these are evanescent remaining advantages, because the core point is that the United States does not dominate the world economy or world trade. And when Mr. Trump put on protectionist barriers, there were a few countries totally freaked out, such as Canada and Mexico, because their entire economy is oriented towards the US market, about 80% of their exports. But for Africa, the US market represents about 8% of Africa's exports. For China, about 12%. It's not to shrug off, but it's not to obsess about either. And this is the change of geopolitical power. In my view, there are no choke points, military or technological or geographic, that gives the US any decisive advantage over China in the world. China cannot stop, US cannot stop China's development, and this means that basically the Western-led geopolitical order is over. And Donald Trump is home in Washington today because he's having a temper tantrum. That's the only reason. Because he wants to be number one, but can't be anymore. Not that the US is threatened or in danger or losing security or suffering from China or anything of the sort, but it just can't demand that everybody does what it wants. And when the US demanded that NATO go to Ukraine, Russia said no. And the US said, we don't care what you say, we're going to do it anyway. And that's why there's the war in Ukraine. But Russia's winning that war on the battlefield, which is why Donald Trump's 28-point plan that was released in the last 2 days basically correctly says this war has to stop because otherwise Ukraine will get completely destroyed. And it has to stop basically with NATO accepting that it will never expand to Ukraine. Russia won't allow it, and the United States can't force it. So this is the second big dimension of the change of the global order, that there is no Western-led world. Europe, by the way, is nowhere to be seen. Very strange, because they're in a panic about Russia. I think that's why. I can't figure it out, but I've never seen such bad leadership in Europe as I see today in the modern post-World War II period. So Europe isn't playing any consequential role in geopolitics right now because it's divided, confused, and wasting its money on military armaments that make no sense. So the third dimension that has come along with all of this is the technological revolution that's underway. It's not independent of the first two. In fact, the technological revolution, the digital revolution, which has been underway for about 90 years now, starting with a genius, Alan Turing, in England in 1936, and then the invention of the modern computer by John von Neumann, and the developments of the semiconductor and all of the advances in the digital age, which go back to the 1930s, are now even in an accelerating change. And we know that because we're all using ChatGPT to write our mail and answer our questions and do our homework assignments and everything else, and grade papers, I suppose, and whatever else. And this is absolutely remarkable, these breakthroughs. This is not small stuff. This is really fundamental in my view. It's not hype. It's very real and very transformative. And it's shaking everything as well. And again, the US thought they had the lead. China is absolutely at the forefront together with the United States on this. And there's a lot more innovation to come. There is no one that's going to have a monopoly on this, neither those countries nor anyone else, because these technologies will be within reach for the whole world, in fact. So the fourth area of transformation, and I say it's not unrelated to the first two because it has been the whole advance of technology that allowed China to leapfrog and to grow so rapidly. It wasn't only catching up by China, but it was deploying cutting-edge technologies. So there's a lot of leapfrogging in what China has done. China didn't merely narrow the gap with the United States, it jumped ahead of the United States in many areas. If you, and this is something for the American Center for the Study of the United States, if you study taking a train from New York to Washington, you can investigate whether the train will ever arrive. because Amtrak sometimes arrives, sometimes doesn't arrive. Once in a while, it's on time. Sometimes it goes 10 or 15 miles an hour, 25 kilometers an hour, because the track isn't so stable. Sometimes, as in my most recent trip, I had to get off in New Jersey and change trains because the train had broken down entirely. China, on the other hand, just built its 50,000th kilometer of fast rail. The United States does not have 1 kilometer of fast rail. Not a single kilometer. And Donald Trump, because he's a little loose in the screws up there, taunted the governor of California for the non-delivery of fast rail on time that is being planned in California. Can you imagine a president of the country taunting a region for failing to have modern infrastructure? That's how strange and self-destructive American politics is right now. But the point is, a lot of catching up is not only narrowing the gap, but it's also leapfrogging. And I want to emphasize that because that's what Africa is going to do in the years ahead as well. A fourth point, yeah, I'm at 4. The environmental disruptions. All that global economic growth, which is perhaps 200 or 300 times the increase of production from the beginning of the 19th century. It's not so meaningful what I just said, but if you try to measure GDP and ask how much has it increased over the course of 225 years, you would get something like 200 times maybe. And the planet has had to absorb all of that. And so that has meant a lot of resource depletion, a lot of tearing down the forests, a lot of expansion of farmland, a lot of overfishing the fisheries, a lot of pollution of the air, the water, the soils, the oceans, and of course, because of the accident that carbon dioxide, which is emitted from burning coal, happens to absorb infrared radiation because of its quantum mechanical properties in the atmosphere, it has warmed the planet also. So we're in an ecological, very, very deep crisis because of the economic growth. We're not helpless in that because what we need to do is focus on the basic science, which is that the human activity is warming the planet or destroying the ecosystems because of specific activities that need to be brought under control. And in the case of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we need to shift to non-carbon energy sources. And lo and behold, our scientific advances are so great that it's actually cheaper now to build a solar field than it is to build a coal-fired power plant if you take into account the whole life cycle. Because once you've built the solar, the fuel is free. And so we have the solutions, and that's what I hope the leaders are talking about tomorrow and the next day, of actually doing something about this, because we've arrived at a quite advanced stage of crisis. Totally solvable, but it requires changing the way we do things. It requires electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engines. It requires solar, wind, hydro, nuclear power, rather than fossil fuel-based energy systems, and so forth. All understood, and by the way, thanks to China, all quite affordable, because China's in a manufacturing revolution of reducing the costs of all of these alternatives by factor 100. 100th of the cost of 20 or 30 years ago for solar modules, for example. So this is all affordable and feasible, but it needs to be done consciously by our governments. And the fifth change that I want to emphasize, and then I will get to the bottom line, is demographic. The world population is changing also dramatically. It's been changing dramatically for 2 centuries, by the way, because 2 centuries ago, at the very beginning of the industrial era, the world population was about 800 million. Today, it's 8 billion. Africa's population was about 300 million in 1950, and today it's 1.5 billion, 5-fold increase in 75 years. So we've been in the midst of a massive a massive demographic change for 2 centuries. But that change is continuing in some notable ways. First, most of the world is reaching the peak or has already reached the peak of their population. So what we have is aging rather than further population growth. China reached its peak population probably 2 years ago on the official estimates, and will now experience quite a significant decline of population. China's at 1.4 billion people. By the end of this century, I can't say almost surely, but the projection is well below 1 billion, and the actual UN medium forecast is below 800 million. The one region of the world where the population continues to grow rapidly is Africa. Africa's population grew 5 times from 1950 till today. It's 1.5 billion. According to the medium forecast of the UN, Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion at mid-century and about 3.7 billion in 2100. And in percentage terms, this means Africa's population was 9% of the world population in 1950. Today, it's 19%. 1 out of every 5 people on the planet is African. And by 2050, it will be about 25% of the world population. And by 2100, 35% of the world population. So Africa will be in the center of the world story, the world history, the world population, the world demographics in the course of this century. Now, what does all of this mean for Africa? That is, for me, the bottom line and the most important point. I believe, not that it is inevitable, but I believe that it is feasible and the right target for Africa essentially to follow the path that China followed between 1980 and 2020, in a process of 40 years going from low income to high income, going from quite widespread continuing poverty, especially in rural areas, to zero poverty during this period. And because of the demographic changes as well, becoming a powerhouse of the world economy. And that is what I think should be envisioned, should be planned for, and should be accomplished. So China used its advantages of planning, foresight, visioning, and even what we call relative lag. It's poverty, meaning a lot of catching up room, and technological innovation to achieve 10% per year economic growth over a 40-year period. There's the rule of 70, which many of you will know. If you want to know how much a growth process, how long it takes for something to double, take the growth rate and divide 70 by that growth rate. So if you're growing at 10% per year, divide 70 by 10, and that means every 7 years, the economy doubles in size. China achieved that kind of doubling over a 40-year period. So think about it. Every 7 years, you double in size. If you do that for 35 years, that's 5 doublings. 2 to the 5th power, 32-time increase of the economy in China, 32 times in 35 years. And because this continued even beyond 35 years, it's been about a 40-time increase of output of China, which is why China became the world's largest economy during this 40-year period. My analysis and recommendation is that Africa chart out such an ambitious trajectory, because Africa's time has come and its turn has come. And that's, I think, what we are also celebrating at this occasion of the G20. China achieved rapid growth for 40 years. The other country of comparable size, India, has been growing at about 7% per year since the year 2000. Again, applying the same rule of 70, that means doubling every 10 years. And India has become, during this 25-year period, the 3rd largest economy in the world. And its poverty is now below 5%. Remember India having poverty everywhere? Its extreme poverty rate is now below 5%. So my view is Africa's next. You're the next region of 1.5 billion people. But it takes some change of perspective and some new strategy. The change of perspective, first of all, is that this has to happen at a continent-wide scale. Africa was left after the imperialist age with 54 countries and a 55th one in dispute. The transformation that I'm talking about cannot happen 54 separate times. It should be an Africa-wide success, because scale matters in economics. China and India were able to grow so fast because of a large economy and a large market that supported a lot of innovation and supported a single strategy that was coherent to build out a power system, to build out a fast rail system, to build out a highway system, to build out a 5G digital system. And Africa, I want to act like the Union, like a continental free trade area that is investing at the African scale to accomplish the same. And that, I think, is the key first step to being able to replicate this rapid catching up plus leapfrogging process. In order to do that, first, think like a union. For great universities like Wits, partner with universities across the continent to help engender this kind of Africa-wide ambition and strategy and know-how to get this done. And for President Ramaphosa and for his colleagues, champion union, true African union, true Pan-Africanism, to be able to accomplish this. And unlike the first time of Pan-Africanism, Britain, France, and the United States can't stop it this time, because Pan-Africanism was stopped from the outside, not from the inside. It was stopped by a bullet in the head of Patrice Lumumba. It was stopped by repeated overthrows by the CIA and MI6, and it cannot happen anymore. They don't have the power, they don't have the space, and Africa can prevent it. And so we can really have an Africa-wide strategy. And that means building out the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure of rail, of digital, of shipping, coastal shipping, and I could say the soft infrastructure of a continental-wide university excellence to put science and technology in the forefront, because this will require a lot of innovation and a lot of homegrown skills all over the continent. My main advice and my main observation, what did China ultimately do? It invested relentlessly in the future. And it invested in three ways. First, in the skills of the population. So the educational standards in China soared over a period of 40 years. Second, it invested in the physical infrastructure, all that I've been talking about, of the tens of thousands of kilometers of high-quality infrastructure. And third, it invested in innovation and business development so that its companies are in the forefront of the world. And that's why we will be driving Chinese electric vehicles and why we will have our friendly humanoid robots made in Shenzhen when they clean up our houses and raise our children and whatever else they're going to do. They're going to be Chinese made. That's just a little joke. But maybe, I don't know. The nice thing about a robot, by the way, when you have children, we have 3, and they're very nice. They're nice to have around. I appreciate them, but it took 30 years to get them through school and all of that. And when you get your robot from Shenzhen soon, it will have 8 PhDs in 3 hours. So it's a little annoying, but it's actually going to be really a great bargain also. It will do your homework, your course assignments. It'll give your lectures. Of course, the audience will all be robots also. But we'll out be having a cup of coffee too, so we'll be enjoying ourselves tremendously. So we need this Africa-wide investment program that invests first in the young people. This vast population increase is so promising if you invest in the skills of the young people. Keep the mindset, no child should be without at least a high school education, upper secondary, minimum, everywhere, quality. No child should be at school without a laptop. Really. You need this for today's world. They're not expensive. They can be part of an education budget. Everybody needs digital access. We're all going to have our AI tutors online, helping us through difficult problem sets and so forth. You need to use the Leapfrog technologies. So investing in the skills is critical. And then, of course, that means all of the rest of the infrastructure that supports this. This, I think, is what the great opportunity is. I think that this is what we really mean by the change of the world order. I believe that by 2050, Africa will be a high-income region. It will be a successful and growing region. It will be a region of peace, and it will be looked to throughout the world for partnership and for innovative solutions. And when that comes to pass, I know that Wits University will have played a huge role in it. Thank you very much.